Moscow never sleeps, as they say. The capital's swamp dwellers are commenting on the morning's events. This is insane, girls. It's just drone after drone. It's just... Which one is this now? The fifth. Yeah, you know, as they always say, we have the best air defense in the world, right? But just look at this. It's burning, damn it. Moscow is actually burning right now. Can you believe it? Look, all the factories, every single one of them, they're just fucking burning to the ground. I mean, I'm getting the hell out of here right now, seriously. I can't take this anymore. I'm so completely done with this whole situation. I just can't handle it anymore. It's too much. Revenge for Kyiv. Moscow is on fire. Ukrainian drones have reached the Kremlin. Long-range sanctions have hit Putin. Kyiv strikes at the heart of Russia. Bars missiles flew with the fire of retribution. The Kremlin is in shock. The Ukrainian vendetta has turned Russian oil refineries into torches. The loudest attack on Moscow was the final warning. More and scarier things are coming. Crimea is being cut off from Russia. Several strategic bridges are under attack at once. The ring around the peninsula is tightening. The occupation is inevitable. I'll share all the details in a moment. Greetings, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Victoria Perepelitsa with the latest news. Moscow is on fire. Our drones prove that everything is achievable. There were up to 200 of them just on the approach to the capital. The smoke blocked out the sun. It's night in the middle of the day there. This is the most effective attack on Moscow.
Another one and another one. Three of them in a minute. Another one. Holy shit. Now, if that isn't a wake-up call, I don't know what is. Seriously, that's it. Another one? Seriously, no. Another one. Fuck, look at what's hitting the city over there. They're firing a missile. That's the fucking air defense over there.
There's another one flying. The Moscow oil refinery in the Kapotnya district was hit again. Large-scale fires broke out on the facility's grounds after the strike. By the way, analysts estimate that in 2026, Ukraine has already attacked 25 of 33 major Russian oil refineries with a capacity of over 1 million tons per year. Next, the moment the Moscow refinery literally lost its roof. What did you say about this attack? And we'll say more later on. Moscow Mayor Sobyanin claims 43 UAVs were shot down, but judging by online footage, many drones reached their targets. Moreover, media reports mention not just drones, but also Ukrainian Bars ballistic missiles. It's hell on live TV.
Girls, I saw debris over there. There was just so much of it everywhere. I really think it must have exploded. The debris just fell down. This whole scene, it's honestly hard to describe. What is this? When will it stop? Look, it fell. There's debris over there. I don't know if you can see. There are pieces lying there. How can anyone possibly live in this kind of reality? Just a completely black sky above us. None of you will ever make it to school or work in these conditions. But it looks so nightmarish. I don't know when it will end.
A Russian Panzer tried to shoot down Ukrainian FPV-1 drones over Moscow, all missed. Due to the air attack, Rosaviatsia implemented the cover plan. The three main airports of the Moscow aviation hub, Vnukovo, Domodedovo, and Sheremetyevo, temporarily introduced restrictions. Departing and arriving flights were delayed or diverted to alternate airfields. The aggressors' defense ministry also claimed that overnight, over various regions, they supposedly intercepted and destroyed 555 Ukrainian UAVs. 113 were over the Bryansk region. On the night of June 18th, drones also reached the city of Gukovo in the Rostov region. At the local oil depot, intense flames and large black columns of smoke are visible, rising into the sky. Anyway, look, tell me, I woke up, looked up, holy shit, it's like day, damn, it just kept flying and flying. President Zelensky commented on the massive drone attack on Moscow. He said long-range sanctions again reached the Moscow region. The head of state confirmed that for the second time in a week, the Moscow oil refinery was hit. Zelensky also noted that targets were struck in the Rostov region and in occupied territories of Ukraine.
A perfectly just response to the Russian strikes on our cities and communities, and another important result of our warriors' work on facilities supporting the Russian military machine. I thank our defense and security forces of Ukraine for their joint work, the SBU, SBS, SSO, GUR, and our missile brigade for their accuracy.
The General Staff and SBU summarized the operation. The General Staff says a fire broke out at the refinery in at least 5 spots. Reports say a combined oil processing unit, a secondary unit, and a tank farm are on fire. The security service stated that the successful strike on the Moscow oil refinery was carried out by warriors of the SBU's Alpha Special Operations Center along with other Defense Force units. The agency emphasized that the refinery is located 15 kilometers from the Kremlin.
Repeated strikes on the Moscow refinery show that Ukrainian drones can systematically hit the enemy's most important strategic targets in the very heart of Russia. Each such attack forces Russia to spend additional resources on repairs, strengthening air defense, and restructuring logistics. The SBU will continue to conduct special operations that drain the aggressor's economic potential and increase the price of war for Russia.
It seems that bridges in occupied Crimea were also attacked last night. According to the Crimean Wind Channel, several strategic crossings were hit at once.
A railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal near the village of Razdolnoye in the Sovetsky district, a road bridge over the North Crimean Canal near the same settlement, a section of the railway, possibly a bridge near the Vladislavovka station in the Kirovsky district, road bridges over the Promoyna Strait on the Arabat Spit in the Kherson region.
Putin has pushed it too far. A fuel crisis has swept across Russia. Problems have reached the heart of the country, and recent events resemble a major systemic failure. A country that for years boasted of its oil wealth has suddenly faced something it was not prepared for. The myth of Russia's inexhaustible resources is evaporating. What is really happening with Russian fuel? Why are alarm signals sounding from different corners of the Russian Federation? And how the war, which planned to wage against others, is hitting Russia itself more and more painfully? We'll tell you now. Putin has fought his way to this. The fuel crisis has reached the very heart of Russia, Moscow and St. Petersburg. In a country that for decades called itself an energy superpower, gas stations have suddenly begun imposing limits on gasoline and diesel. Now, fuel is being dispensed almost like a scarce commodity, no more than 20 liters of gasoline and 40 liters of diesel per person. The irony of the situation is that this is happening not somewhere in the backwoods, but in the country's two main cities. Even more interesting is the reaction of officials. The authorities traditionally insist that there is no shortage and that reserves are sufficient. However, if fuel is truly in abundance, then why limit its sale? It seems the Russian bureaucracy has once again invented its own version of reality, where emptying reservoirs are called stable supplies and limits at gas stations are labeled as an absence of problems. Just recently, Russian propaganda mocked Ukrainian fuel lines. Now, similar problems are overwhelming Russia, from Moscow and Petersburg to Rostov, Kazan, Kursk, and Volgograd. And while the Kremlin continues to talk about the strength of its economy, in practice, a country with some of the world's largest oil reserves is suddenly starting to save gasoline. It seems the main enemy of the Russian fuel industry is no longer sanctions, but the consequences of its own war. Problems have also reached Tatarstan, one of Russia's key oil regions, which ranks second in oil production and is among the leaders in its refining. There, drones struck the Tenneco and Taifenke oil refineries. It is from there that the country's fuel market is largely supplied. So, when difficulties begin in the very heart of Russian oil refining, it's no surprise that the consequences quickly reach even Moscow and St. Petersburg. It turns out to be quite awkward. Strikes are heard hundreds of kilometers from the capital, yet gasoline limits are already being introduced near the Kremlin. The behavior of the oil giants themselves adds a special touch of comedy to the situation. Until recently, they claimed that there were no problems, and talk of a shortage was an exaggeration. But reality proved to be stubborn. First, restrictions appeared in the Moscow region, then in New Moscow, and now they've reached the country's largest cities. One gets the impression that the Russian authorities are trying to convince the public there's no fire, while they themselves run around the house with buckets. The regions that are supposed to feed the entire country have also suffered. In the Irkutsk region, farmers are already openly talking about the threat of bankruptcy. There's not enough diesel and prices have soared to record levels. And sowing work is simply stopping in some places. The Beretskoye farm has already been forced to suspend its campaign due to a lack of fuel. What a turn of events! An energy superpower cannot fuel its own tractors. The problem turned out to be so serious that local farmers were offered to fuel heavy agricultural machinery at regular gas stations. It sounds almost like a joke, but these are exactly the kinds of ideas officials are proposing now. However, the farmers just throw up their hands. Huge combines and tractors physically cannot operate schemes. And while officials are coming up with new ways to fight reality, diesel fuel has nearly doubled in price since February, exceeding the mark of 100,000 rubles per ton. And the most interesting thing is that this is no longer a local story. Diesel shortages and fuel sales restrictions are being recorded in at least 25 regions of Russia. Krasnoyarsk Krai, Rostov region, Krasnodar Krai, the list is constantly growing. Farmers complain that they cannot buy fuel even at sky-high prices, and delivery times have turned into a real lottery. And while the Kremlin spends colossal resources on the war, its own agricultural sector is beginning to suffocate from a resource deficit. However, while fuel has only just begun to be rationed on Russian territory, in occupied Crimea, the situation looks significantly bleaker. There, gasoline is gradually turning into a strategic resource. Local residents stand in lines at gas stations for hours, but even that doesn't guarantee success. Because as soon as a fuel truck arrives at the gas station, the Russian military often gets access to the fuel first. The army, which supposedly fully controls the peninsula, is now taking resources for itself before the civilian population. Against this backdrop, what usually accompanies any shortage is starting to flourish in Crimea, a black market. Fuel is resold through intermediaries or even directly from fuel trucks, but at a price 2 to 3 times higher than the official one. It seems that the peninsula is gradually returning to the wild 90s, when the right goods could only be found through connections and for completely different money. Most tellingly, the occupation authorities are already forced to introduce strict control measures. A QR code system has appeared in Sevastopol, and a limit of only 20 liters of fuel per day has been set for each car. Inspectors and officials are on duty near gas stations, ensuring that drivers do not buy gasoline repeatedly. The irony is that all this is happening in a territory that the Kremlin has showcased for years as a window of its successful integration. The cause of these problems is becoming increasingly obvious. After a series of strikes on military logistics and fuel infrastructure, the occupiers can no longer rely on previous stockpiles. Every strike on logistics, every damaged route, and every supply disruption is almost instantly reflected in lines at gas stations. It seems the fuel crisis, which began as a local problem, is gradually turning into another serious headache for the Kremlin. The most unpleasant thing for Russia is that this no longer looks like a temporary glitch. If a country calling itself an energy superpower is forced to ration gasoline sales, a perfectly logical question arises: what will happen next? It seems that Ukrainian strikes are increasingly hitting not just individual plants, but also the very myth of Russia's inexhaustible resources. And this myth is beginning to melt faster than gasoline disappears from Russian gas stations.
Putin has lost control. The smell of crisis is growing stronger in the Kremlin. And the most interesting thing is that it's no longer oppositionists or Western experts raising the alarm, but people from within the Russian system itself. While propaganda continues to talk about stability and unity, Russian deputies have openly begun talking about corruption, the risk of mass unrest, and growing public discontent. Meanwhile, economic problems, Ukrainian drone strikes, internet outages, and new sanctions only increase the pressure on the Kremlin. It seems it's getting harder for Putin's government to hide the true state of affairs and the cracks in the facade of the unyielding fortress are becoming so noticeable that they are already seen even within the Russian government itself. Putin is a step from collapse. The stench of crisis is growing in the Kremlin, and this time it's not the opposition sounding the alarm at all. Even in the Russian State Duma, it's becoming increasingly difficult to hide the nervousness. Communist Party deputy Vyacheslav Markayev openly accused the Kremlin of corruption and warned that Russia is approaching a powerful social explosion. According to him, the time for illusions is over, and the responsibility for potential chaos will lie entirely with the current government. For a system where officials have competed in loyalty to Putin for years, such statements sound like a very alarming signal from within. Even more interesting is that Markayev spoke directly about the risk of mass unrest and effectively admitted that the situation in the country is becoming increasingly unstable. Another deputy, Communist Renat Suleimanov, who previously called for ending the war as soon as possible, joined the criticism. It seems that even in political circles loyal to the Kremlin, people are increasingly starting to ask an uncomfortable question: how much longer can Russia endure this war? The reasons for dissatisfaction are piling up one after another. Mass internet outages, the lack of tangible success at the front, economic problems, and regular Ukrainian drone strikes on the Russian rear are increasingly affecting the public mood. And while propaganda continues to talk about stability, even representatives of the system itself are already starting to speak openly about the fact that dangerous social tension is building up beneath the facade of Kremlin confidence. Meanwhile, Kyiv is adding fuel to the fire. Volodymyr Zelensky's publication of intelligence data on the internal situation in Russia was a real cold shower for Putin. The president stated that Ukrainian intelligence had obtained documents on the real internal political situation in Russia. The very reports that land directly on the desk of Putin. And even despite the tradition of Russian officials sugarcoating reality, the picture emerging there is quite grim.
We understand that Putin is rarely given completely truthful information without embellishment, but even what he sees in the documents that reach him still allows for certain conclusions to be drawn.
According to intelligence, the level of Russian dissatisfaction with Putin continues to grow and shows no signs of stabilizing, even on the eve of the September elections. Moreover, support for the ruling party is gradually declining, and this creates a rather uncomfortable dilemma for the Kremlin. Either explain to voters why everything is getting worse, or once again demonstrate miracles of electoral mathematics. No less alarming for Moscow is the growth of protest sentiment in the regions. While Russian propaganda talks about national unity, the authorities themselves seem to be carefully calculating where and when the accumulated dissatisfaction might break through, especially considering that summer is still ahead, with its economic problems, strikes on logistics, fuel difficulties, and Ukrainian drone attacks.
We believe that these reports do not yet take into account potential events in June, July, and August, which cannot fail to further affect the situation in Russia.
And this is where the most interesting part begins. Ukraine is no longer hiding its intention to keep ramping up pressure on Russia, military, economic, and diplomatic. This means the toughest months for the Kremlin may still be ahead. After all, when the economy weakens at the same time, social problems pile up, ratings drop, and drones start flying in. Even the most powerful propaganda begins to fail.
The perfectly justified pressure on Russia for this war will continue and intensify, and not just our pressure. Consequently, by September, Putin will reach even worse performance indicators.
This is a kind of public reminder. While Russian propaganda tries to convince the world of the regime's stability, Ukraine increasingly shows a completely different image of a Kremlin that is losing control over what is happening and is forced to constantly put out new crises. The last few months for Moscow have turned into a real streak of bad luck. Fuel problems in a country that for decades took pride in its status as an energy superpower, strikes on logistics, attacks on strategic targets, and constant failures in the information war. A rather sarcastic picture is emerging. The Kremlin still talks about its strength, but spends more and more time not on the offensive, but on dealing with the consequences of its own problems. Ukraine's main bet now is not only on destroying individual targets, but on maintaining a pace of strikes and challenges that Russia simply doesn't have time to adapt to. The longer the economic, budgetary, and social exhaustion continues, the weaker the Kremlin's ability to respond to new strikes becomes. And when the system starts to lag behind events, every new problem automatically generates several more. That is why, on the eve of the G7 summit, the NATO meeting, and a new package of sanctions, Kyiv is actively promoting a simple message for Western partners. Russia no longer looks like a party that is in control of the situation. On the contrary, more and more signs indicate that the Kremlin's resources are being depleted faster than it can hide it. And as we know, people are much more willing to invest in someone who can win than in someone who tries to explain their problems with more propaganda fairy tales. And the most unpleasant thing for Moscow is that problems are piling up from several sides at once. A new package of EU sanctions, increased pressure on the shadow oil fleet, risks to energy revenues, and an increasingly active Ukrainian campaign of long-range strikes. If until recently the Kremlin sold the world the image of an impregnable fortress, today this image increasingly resembles the facade of a building where cracks are already visible even from a distance. And it seems Ukraine's main task now is not to let these cracks heal, but to turn them into a real collapse. Putin is being dragged into negotiations. The dictator's refusal will be taken as a political fiasco. This is a trap from which the Kremlin simply has nowhere to go. In this new tough format, Russia suddenly isn't a geopolitical player, but a party either forced to the table or publicly seen as running away from it. Trump and Zelensky are effectively setting a new reality. The Kremlin doesn't set the rules, it's told what they are. And every new move by Moscow no longer looks like a strategy, but an attempt to dodge an awkward conversation that, before the eyes of the world, could turn into a political death sentence. More on this in our report. Trump is pulling Putin into negotiations in the United States, and this could be a trap the Kremlin won't escape. Donald Trump supports the idea of a three-way meeting involving Zelensky, Putin, and the United States on American soil. The plan is simple and harsh. Either Putin sits at the negotiating table under pressure from Washington, or he openly shows the world that he's the one avoiding dialogue. The Kremlin is at a dead end. Before, they easily found excuses. The wrong format, the wrong time. But now everything is different. When the United States and Trump personally are the initiators, any refusal starts to look like a political retreat. Zelensky only intensifies this pressure. The United States negotiation format under Trump's aegis is no longer just a meeting. It's a public stage for the whole world. If you agree, you'll have to answer directly for the war. If you refuse, the retreat will be obvious to everyone. If Moscow rejects this chance too, the conversation could move to a different level. A level of additional pressure. And then for the Kremlin, the problem won't be the meeting's location or the negotiation format. Then they'll have to explain their reluctance to find a way out of the war, which is costing Russia itself more and more. And that's a whole different level of political discomfort. For years, the Kremlin built the image of a strong geopolitical player who dictates terms to others. But now the situation risks turning into a political joke. Every time a real opportunity to sit at the negotiating table arises, the Russian side finds a new reason to stay as far away from that table as possible. And the more often this happens, the louder the world asks, who is actually afraid of negotiations? Especially since this is far from the first attempt to get the Kremlin to the negotiating table. Earlier, Zelensky had already proposed a meeting with Putin on the sidelines of the G7 summit with the participation of the world's leading democratic states. It would seem that for a man who for years spoke of readiness for peace and dialogue, this was a great chance to back up his words. But the result was predictable. The Russian leader refused to participate. As soon as a real negotiating platform appears, the Kremlin instantly finds new reasons not to show up. First, a reluctance to meet with Zelensky, then a lack of interest in the G7 format. Now a new proposal is on the table, a meeting in the United States with Trump's participation. And the impression is growing that the problem for Moscow isn't the location of the negotiations or even their format. After all, the longer this diplomatic game of hide-and-seek continues, the louder the uncomfortable question sounds. If the Kremlin truly seeks peace, why does its leader so persistently avoid a personal conversation? A man who likes to project the image of a fearless geopolitical player hasn't been able to find time for a meeting for several years now, one that is supposedly meant to bring the end of the war closer. And if Putin also rejects the American format being promoted by Zelensky and Trump, it will become much harder for him to make excuses. Because sooner or later the world may come to a simple conclusion. Perhaps it is not Kyiv or the West that is running away from negotiations. After all, the main record holder for avoiding peace meetings is located right there in the Kremlin. Earlier, Zelensky had already used a very direct diplomatic signal to Putin, an open public letter with a proposal to end the war and hold a personal meeting. This was not just a political gesture, but an attempt to bring the conversation to the level of a direct challenge, either a dialogue or the final confirmation of the Kremlin's unwillingness to conduct it. A special emphasis was placed on the fact that Ukraine does not want an endless war and sees a real chance for its conclusion. Zelensky stated directly that the majority of Russians could also support the idea of ending the hostilities. And rejecting this path means a conscious continuation of the escalation, which has long gone far beyond the Kremlin's initial expectations. In fact, it was a call to exit the war, sounding like a political warning. It is important that the format of negotiations in this letter was immediately taken beyond the framework of Ukraine and Russia. Neutral countries, including Switzerland, Turkey, and Middle Eastern states, were named as possible venues. Ukraine also stated its readiness, in the event of a real dialogue, to consider a temporary cessation of hostilities and the involvement of the United States and Europe in the process. Thus, this letter became another stage of diplomatic pressure, an attempt to move the war from the plane of combat operations into the sphere of direct political responsibility. And if new negotiation formats involving the United States are being discussed today, then this step looks like a preliminary signal. Kyiv is consistently trying to bring the Kremlin into a direct dialogue, increasing the level and scale of pressure. One cannot ignore the story of Roman Abramovich, who secretly visited Zelensky for closed-door negotiations. The irony is that negotiation channels sometimes turn out to be more alive than official ones. And while Russian television talks about a monolithic vertical, in reality, this vertical has long resembled a network of separate wires that are themselves looking for where to plug in so as not to be left without power. And among these wires, people from the inner circle of the Russian elite suddenly appear, who for some reason prefer to speak not through the Kremlin, but bypassing it. The situation looks quite amusing. Officially, no negotiations, no concessions, we dictate the terms. Unofficially, intermediary businessmen are quietly knocking on various doors, trying to find at least a small window for agreements. The topic of negotiations has long gone beyond ordinary diplomacy and turned into a political test of readiness to bear responsibility. The United States, through a potential format involving Trump, is effectively raising the stakes to the maximum. Either Putin comes to a public conversation about the war, or the world records his refusal as a conscious evasion of dialogue. And against this background, every new initiative from the G7 to the American platform only narrows the room for maneuver, leaving the Kremlin with fewer neutral formulations and more uncomfortable questions without answers. What do you think about the latest events? We're waiting for your comments. There's more to come. Stay up to date. And don't forget to like. Wishing you peaceful skies.